My name is Matthew Covey. I am the founding partner of Covey Law, not very creatively named law firm. I'm also the executive director of Thomasdot, which I think a lot of you know is a nonprofit that does work on artist mobility issues to the US. My colleague Will Spitz and partner at Covey Law is here. He runs the performing arts division at Covey Law, and we are going to be talking through a bunch of issues related to artist visas coming into the US. We would encourage you to ask questions as we go along. If you have a question and something doesn't make sense, if it doesn't make sense to you, it probably doesn't make sense to other people. So raise your hand or holler. Matt here has a mic so everybody can hear your question. He'll scamper over to you and give you the mic if you have a question. We encourage that because if we wait till the end to do questions, chances are pretty good we will have forgotten what the question was about, and it won't really make that much sense at that point. So let's keep those questions coming. Is this going to work? Yes. Oh, no. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk first for a bunch about the topic of the things that an artist can do in the US when they don't have a visa. And then we're going to kind of segue into the getting a visa process for artists. That's a fair start. This is a flow chart here of what we call the first question, which is, does the artist actually need a visa or not? And this would be a good thing to take a picture of because we will be referring to this flow chart as we move forward. So that would be a way to start. So don't everyone rush the stage to take your picture all at the same time. It's fine. So actually, let's do another quick thing. Who is artists? Cool. Agents? Managers? Labels? There we go. Okay, cool. Anybody else I've missed? Associations. That's good. NGOs. Associations. Cool. Sorry, what did you say? PRO. That's an association. That works. It's an NGO. Something like that. All good. Okay, cool. Export offices. All of you, I see why all of you are here. It all's making sense. It's all making sense.
How many people have been through or helped an artist through the process of seeking an artist visa? Okay.
Cool. So we're going to go fairly quickly through the basics of how the process works so as not to bore the people who know it, and then get on to kind of updates about what we're seeing currently in the field. But again, because we're moving quickly, if we're moving too quickly, by all means, make us stop. Okay, so as many of you know, if you're working with international anything coming into the US, there's sort of two major categories. People from a lot of countries, Europe, Australia, handful of other countries around the world don't need a visa to enter the US. They enter on what people refer to colloquially as ESTA, which means you just go online before you travel, you fill out a little form, you pay a little fee, you fly to the US, and you're probably fine. That's a great way to travel to the US if you're coming on vacation or if you're going to a business meeting or things like that. But it's important to know that there's a very strict limitation on what you can do on ESTA in the US. And the general sense is if you do anything that's starting to become employment, at a certain point it tips over and you have to be getting an employment visa. So the devil is in the details of where does that point tip? What activities can you no longer do on ESTA? The other thing that's important to realize is that for people who are coming from parts of the world where they cannot travel to the US on ESTA, it's the same analysis, but it's basically a tourist visa. It's a visitor's visa. Do you need a visitor's visa to come to the US? And is that sufficient for the activities that you're planning to do? Getting a visitor's visa, getting ESTA is super easy. Getting a visitor's visa normally is fairly simple compared with getting an employment visa, which is enormously complex and enormously expensive. So the question of can we avoid getting an employment visa is always something that everybody's always trying to figure out, how can I avoid having to do that? How can I squish whatever it is I'm planning to do in the US within the definition of what you can do on ESTA or on a visitor's visa? So that's the first thing I want to talk about, because at Thomasdot, that's probably 80% of the questions we get is like, wait, really? Do I really need to get an employment visa for this? Can't I just like come in and do it? And I'm like, oh, let's do the analysis. So the analysis, there we go. What activities require a visa? From a musician standpoint, the best thing to do is start from the assumption that if you're doing anything professional, or if your artist is doing anything professional in the US, you start from the assumption that that's going to be considered employment and they're going to need an employment visa unless you can find an exception to that rule. It's way safer to go that way than the other way, which is like, I'm sure it's going to be fine. Oh, it's not? You're better off saying it's not going to be fine, we need to get an employment visa, and then try to see if there's an exception to that rule that allows the artist to come and do the thing that they wanted to do without getting a visa, or without getting an employment visa. There's a couple of really important ones for this community, a couple of exceptions to that rule. The first, and the one that's material to us here at this event, is something that's referred to as the showcase exception. There isn't actually any law that describes a showcase exception, but it's something that's fairly well accepted and works fairly well in certain situations. But the thing that's important to understand about the showcase exception is that while the idea is that in general knowledge, is it allows an artist to come and play at a showcase event without having to get an employment visa, coming in on ESTA or coming in on a B1 visitor's visa. The question is, what's a showcase? What constitution? And a lot of people think it's not getting paid. A lot of people think like, well, it's promotional. No, that's not the definition of a showcase. The definition of a showcase from the legal standpoint is if it's more of an audition than it is a performance. So the way that we usually describe this to clients is we say, look, if the principal purpose, this is what you write down if you're taking notes, if the principal purpose that the audience is in attendance is not to have a good time, if the audience is there to think about hiring this artist in the future, then chances are you're dealing with a situation that could be classified as a showcase event. The problem is that there are only so many of those happening. And with many things with immigration law, as you know, there's what happens what the law says and what happens in real life. And these things are not really the same thing frequently. So the law says that if the principal reason that your audience is attending is because they're considering hiring you, that's more of an audition, then you don't need an employment visa to do that performance. That's great. But the memo that came from the government that said that literally said if the artist was performing at a bona fide showcase event like South by Southwest, they don't need an employment visa. So I assume most of us have been to South by Southwest. Are people there to have a good time? Yes, obviously they are, right? So how do you parse that? Well, South by is fine because it's actually written into the memo, so that's good. But what about Indie Week? What about Mondo? What about New Colossus Festival? What about Folk Alliance? What about Americana Fest? What about APAP? All of these conferences which have a strong industry presence, but also have a public-facing side. And the answer to that is just be really careful. And part of what Thomasdot does as an organization is we provide pro bono legal assistance to arts organizations and artists. So basically, if you have a question about whether the event that your artist is performing at is or is not a showcase, have them reach out to us. We've worked with most of the major showcase events in the US to draft invitation letters that are pretty watertight legally, and we haven't had very many problems with that over the years. But if you're working with a showcase event and you're not sure they know what they're doing, or you're not sure if it's a showcase, reach out to us. We can't decide if it's a showcase or not, but we can help you figure out whether the risk of entering and saying, I'm going to do this as a showcase, whether you're risking a lot or the artist is risking a lot in that situation. Did that make sense?
Matthew, what if, so you're coming to do South by?
Yeah.
Or Folk Alliance, or an event that's generally accepted as being fitting this showcase
Yeah.
exception, but while you're in town, you get offered another show, but you're not getting paid. You're in Austin, it's under this, it's South by adjacent.
Right,
Sure. Is that okay as long as you're not getting paid? It's a promotional show. There is going to be industry people there. You're inviting your potential booking agent or whatever.
Right. This question is a ruse. Will actually knows the answer to this question. It's a subterfuge. So the answer to that question, again, there is no legal answer to that question. The answer is a weighing of risks. And I would say that if you've got an artist flying into the U.S., and the officer looks, and they say, no, it's cool. I'm going to play South by. I'm just doing it on ESTA. And the officer Googles them, and they say, okay, there's your official showcase. There's your official showcase. Oh, but I see you're playing the Converse All-Stars Barbecue the afternoon before. There is a significant chance that officer is going to say, that's not an official showcase. That's not an official showcase event. We're going to put you on the plane and send you home. It doesn't happen all the time. Many officers would turn a blind eye to it, but if the officer said that, they would be right. So it's something to be really careful of. The way South by articulates it is if you're playing only bona fide official showcase gigs, then you're fine. If you're playing anything else, then you should be getting an employment visa. The other thing about this is if any artist is coming all the way over, chances are pretty good they're going to be playing a short tour or at least some other shows in Austin. So that's a tough one to talk about with your clients because a lot of times somebody says, yeah, I'm coming to South by, I don't need a visa, right? And they're like, well, yeah, but what else are you doing? Yeah.
In that hypothetical with the Converse situation, what if the party wasn't Converse? What if the party?
You're on.
What if the party isn't Converse, but it's an industry, like say it's Sound Exchange,
Right.
their private party, or that kind, where is that more industry showcase?
Again, it is, but the problem with something like that is, the definition of what constitutes employment is the benefit of the work being done in the U.S. flowing to a U.S. entity. So if Sound Exchange is doing a party and they've got bands playing at the party, part of the reason that everybody's going to be going to the Sound Exchange event is to see those bands because they're providing entertainment. Are they also there to be scoped out by artists or by labels and agents? Maybe, but my concern is, so you could make the argument that this is also a showcase, but my concern is what happens at the border and what's the officer going to say?
By definition, isn't Sound Exchange paying South by a heap of money to be an official party? Like a lot of those parties are official parties.
Yeah, that's possibly true too.
How the border guy knows that?
Right. Yeah, and but
very gross.
so this is the thing where you start to getting in the weeds, and what we're trying to do is advise people on like, what's the officer going to think? And that's where it gets complex. You could make the argument, like if they got deported and you took it up in court, you might be able to win that case, but we don't want to go there. So, okay, so that's one exception. Yeah.
Like how much are people at customs at the border like equipped with knowledge of like the intricacies of ONP visas or artist visas, like knowing that that's the place where people may have been held up?
They know, for the most part. Yeah, they've got a pretty good, at major ports, they're going to have a pretty good, like, we find that when artists are, when there's, literally, 8,000 artists flying into the U.S. in March, most Customs and Border Protection officers, at the major airports at least, are going to know what that is. Now, if you're crossing from Canada in the forest at 2 in the morning, you might have an officer who doesn't get it, and that's when I get a call that wakes me up in the middle of the night saying, what do I do? They won't let the drummer in. Okay, so that's one exception. Another exception I want to move quickly, although that's sort of the main one that concerns people. Another exception that's really important for export offices is the topic of if your artist is performing at an event which is sponsored by their home country and the audience is not paying admission, that's seen as kind of like an embassy event, and you don't need a visa for that. So say, for example, if Australia were to have a huge party in Central Park with Australian art, imagine that, right? Imagine that. If that were to happen, and it was a bunch of Australian artists, and it was free to the general public, and say the Australian government's paying for the whole thing, well, you wouldn't. Possibly about 4 p.m. on Saturday. Be there or be square. So if that were to happen, they would not need to have employment visas, unless, of course, they're going to be doing shows in addition to that, in which case they would.
Yes, Matt, sorry, just
yeah.
on that one. So say it's outside of something like South by. So we, as Music from Ireland, the Export Office from Ireland, do events with our consulates in LA and New York.
Yep.
We do school night in Los Angeles,
Yep.
and we have, for the most part, over the last 3 or 4 years, counting COVID out, the artists we were bringing had visas. They were
Right.
at that level, but 1 or 2 aren't. And we've been able to get an ESTA in that situation. So because school night is a buyer, it is an audition kind of night.
Yeah.
And I think that's why. But in general, if we were to like start doing trade missions, say in New York, and it was co-funded by the government agency here and us at home, what is that still an ESTA situation? If it's free on the door, an invited audience industry, but it's not a showcase, is that still
So
ESTA qualified?
I think I understand. I think I know the school night structure, but basically the question is, if you have an artist who's, if I'm not answering your question, I'm sure you'll tell me, Angela, but if you've got a situation where an artist is coming playing a showcase event, clearly a showcase event, they're playing, South by, or they're playing Folk Alliance, and then you have them do an event that's sponsored by the Irish government, and the admission is not charged at the door. You don't have to have, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, so.
I'm talking like separate to South by.
Yeah.
We come to New York
Yeah.
to do like a show that's free on the door. Sorry. That's free on the door.
Oh,
but
right.
it's co-funded. Like the artists are being paid to be here. They're not getting a fee. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, so that would be fine. So legally it's fine, but also the crucial thing here is they probably have an invitation letter that says the cultural attaché of Ireland is inviting them to do this, and that's the letter that
that
literally at the border when they say, "What are you doing here? You've got 6 guitars." You hand them a letter that has the letterhead of the cultural of the embassy, and they're like, "All right, that's fine."
That's like 2 separate analyses.
Yeah.
Like the showcase exception is totally separate from the cultural programs exception. I mean, I could imagine a hybrid where it's both, but you would sort of want to do that analysis separately, I think.
Right. I'm going to move on because we have limited time. It's important to understand. There's also an academic exception, which is really complex. And if you've got artists performing at universities or colleges, it may or may not apply. But that's what the kind of thing. Reach out to us because it's got like not more than 5 dates over 6 months, and like it's complex. So, but if you have university, or if you have an artist who's doing university or college shows and only those, ask us about it because we can help you parse whether that's going to fall within the exception or not. The other thing, just to mention, the U.S. law makes a distinction between a road manager and a manager. A manager, you'll be pleased to know, is unnecessary on the road. The notion is that if a manager is coming on a tour, they're there to network, they're maybe going to come to a major market, they're going to do deals, they're going to do that kind of stuff, but they're not part of the crew. Whereas the road manager, settling up at the end of the night, advancing the show, making sure the hotel didn't cancel the reservations, all those things that a road manager does, that's part of the crew, and they need to have an employment visa to do that. How do you know the difference? Well, you know the difference because you know what tasks you're undertaking. But here's where the question of whether it's how the law works in reality, and some of you heard me say this before. So you've got a band from Canada. I'm looking at you. You've got a band from Canada driving in at 3 a.m. and through the forest. And they're in the van, and it's 4 dudes, and they're wearing leather, and they haven't shaved. And they're in the band, and they all have P1 or P1 visas. And the manager is also a dude who's in his early 20s and unshaved and wearing leather. They get to the border, and the border says, "Okay, you guys have your visas, but what about this other guy? I think you're the drummer who forgot to get the visa." No, I'm the manager. Well, there's the number of times that we've had the manager kicked out of the van and stopped at the border because the ban goes through, but they decide because their profile is, this is like, you guys all look the same. Whereas if the manager's like 65, slightly overweight and bald, that will not be a problem because they're gonna be like, oh, you look like a manager to me, you're fine. So you've got to sort of think a little bit about the way they're thinking. If you look the same as your artist and you're the manager, you might want to fly and meet them when on the other side of the border. Something to be careful about. Or shave, or bathe, or whatever. Or be a woman. That would also help. That would solve the problem just like that. One other thing I want to mention, we're talking about how when you need an employment visa, when you don't, and when ESTA is fine. There's one other consideration which was a big deal until COVID and now is a little bit less of a big deal because of technical issues in the world. South by took the position, because we talked with them about this for months, that you can, while artists can come on ESTA, it's not necessarily the best idea. Because what that means, if you're coming on ESTA, if you run into a problem, you're going to run into the problem when you arrive at the border. What's a better thing to do is get a B1 visa. It costs $190. It's not that hard to get normally. And then the embassy has already reviewed what you're doing in your home country. So when you arrive at the border, what the officers tend to say, actually invariably say, is, I don't know what you're doing. You could have come on ESTA, but you got yourself a B1 visa. I'm not going to second guess whatever the embassy was. When the embassy reviewed your situation, they decided a B1's fine. I'm not going to second guess it. So I've literally never had an artist who could have come on ESTA, who went to the bother of getting a B1 visa, have a problem at the border. So it's kind of an insurance policy. That's what we used to say. Then there was a pandemic. The State Department has been in shambles ever since. Afghanistan and Ukraine did not help that, staffing-wise, and because of that, there have been enormous delays in getting B1 visas at U.S. embassies around the world. So, for the last 2 years with South by, we've taken the position that ESTA is actually a lesser risk than trying to get a visa through that kind of currently dysfunctional situation. So it may go back to the other way if the embassies get their act together, and we may start saying you should get a B1 visa because it's slightly safer. But for the moment right now, if you're coming on an exception, ESTA's probably fine if you're eligible for it. That's the exceptions. Okay, moving on. One last thing. Can I just come on ESTA, says the band? Can I just?
Hello.
Yeah.
So if an act's coming in to write and to record, they can come in on Nesta, can't they?
That's a good question.
Should I feel
Because we've been doing that for
Okay.
a while.
Recording.
No shows.
Yeah, no shows. Recording. The recording exception is really old and doesn't make any sense in the age of the internet, because it says that if you're not going to be distributing the recording in the US, you don't need a visa to do it. That doesn't make any sense because who can control that at this point? So the way that the embassies tend to enforce that, and Customs and Border Protection tends to enforce it, is if you are coming to the US to record pursuant to a US contract, you need to have a you need to have an employment visa because you're coming to work. The benefit of your recording is going to a U.S. entity. If you're coming to record in the U.S. pursuant to a non-U.S. contract, you don't. You can do that on ESTA or on a tourist visa. How would they know? You want to have a letter from your label. If you've got a letter from your British label, your German label saying this is what you're doing.
A lot of acts that are coming in are totally indie and releasing it worldwide digitally.
Yep.
Quite tricky, isn't it?
It's very tricky, and so there's a risk anytime you come in saying like, no, I'm coming to record. Although honestly, we've had very few problems with artists who come in with a letter that explains the law in the letter, so the officer knows you've done your due diligence. It usually works, but it is a little bit of a risk.
Especially if, if you're doing it, you're signed to a UK label but not a US label, so there's no contractual agreement with any US entity, but you know that it's going to be distributed in the US.
Right.
I think that's a little bit of, it's not really a gray area, it's risky because the text of the law says if there's an intent to release the recording in the US, then you need a work visa. So that's sort of the conservative answer to that question. I mean, I think if you said, it's hard because like who can, Customs and Border Protection is judging like your intention to do something in the future. Like, yeah, I'd love to release this in the U.S., but if there's no actual contract, there's no release plan in the U.S., then you're probably okay.
Just for this piece up here, just to be really clear, just because you're not getting paid doesn't mean you're not working. It's really important to understand that. I think most people in this audience are sophisticated. 10 years ago, that blew people's minds. Now I think most people have got that worked out. Not getting paid, you can easily be performing shows, you're not getting paid for them. But as far as immigration law is concerned, you're still working and you still need an employment visa, which is not fair. It sucks. Doesn't make any sense given our world, but it's the way it goes. Oops, I went too fast. So this is where I'm going to start handing it over to you, Will.
Sure.
Okay, fine. What my artist is doing in the U.S. is not falling into the exceptions, so they're going to need an employment visa. Well, what are the employment visas?
There are basically four categories of work visas for artists available to artists. There's O1, which is for usually solo artists or, usually solo artists. If they have a backing band or any crew, those individuals would go on an O2 petition, which is for the essential support staff of an O1 artist. P1 is for groups, internationally recognized groups. P2 is generally very limited. For all intents and purposes, basically only available to Canadian musicians. So the process for P2 visa is a lot easier, and it's done through the Musicians Union, but essentially only available to Canadian musicians. P3 is for culturally unique artists, which basically means unique to some, they perform some sort of art form that's unique to a certain group of people, traditional music or folk music or something that's, again, culturally specific. And each one of those general categories has the support personnel, the corresponding support personnel category. So it's a little bit different for O1, O2. Like I said, an O1 artist, it's just for an individual. A group can't get an O1 visa. But if you've got a prominent front person or it's a solo artist with a backing band, O1 for the individual and O2 for everybody else. The rest of them, the performers can, for P visas, the performers go on the principal petition, and then all the non-performing crew go on a corresponding support petition, if there is any.
Just a note, probably once a month we get somebody calling us in tears because they filed an application for a P3 culturally unique visa because they thought they were culturally unique. Because every artist thinks they're culturally unique. And in a way they are. But that's not what this is about. This is about indigenous or folk traditional artwork that's traditional to your country. If you're a Tuvan throat singer from Brazil, you're not going to get a P3 visa because you're not from Tuva. You have to be coming from the country. There's some variations on this. There's notions of hybrid that you can get away with. But basically the idea is if you're coming to present something that's unique to your culture, there is a special visa for that.
Yeah, the word unique always throws people off because it doesn't mean unique in like we're the only band that does this thing. It means unique to a certain region or a certain culture.
Right.
The other thing to say is, so a lot of times you don't really have a choice. You're a band and you need a P1 visa. There's no solo artist or obvious renowned front person. So, and you're not culturally unique, so P1 is the only option. But there are certain instances where you have a choice. For example, if you're the Rolling Stones, you could get a P1 for the whole group, or you could potentially do an O1 for Mick Jagger and O2 for everybody else. But
If their egos can handle it.
what?
If their egos can, yeah, that's always an issue.
I mean, yeah. So I think we get into like the sort of requirements and the various considerations on if you do have a
The strategic difference between the O1 and the O's and the P's is the O's can last for up to 3 years, the P's can't. So you're going to put all the money and effort into getting a visa and an O1, O2 combination is available, you're probably going to go for it because it's no more expensive to get 3 years than it is to get one. So you might as well get 3 years. Questions? Question.
What are the requirements for P1s and 2s?
Okay.
In advance of the application, what are the requirements? In other words, do you still have to do this? Do you have to have 6 months of bookings or some of these requirements? Can you just touch
That's
on
a
that?
good question. So for O1, P1, and P3, you need to show that there's going to be work in the U.S. for the entire validity period, the visa validity period you're seeking, which obviously doesn't make any sense. O visas can be valid for 3 years. No one's booking shows 3 years in advance. But there's ways, and I don't know if we need to get into like the specifics here, but there's ways to sort of present the evidence. You know, if you have a long-term relationship with your record label or booking agency, and you can say, this artist has, a 10-year with all the options in the recording contract, we're going to need them here for, 10 years. And here's a proposed, sort of good faith itinerary to span the 3 years. That's an option. But if you don't, so it's important to understand that those long validity periods are never automatic. So you need to provide some sort of documentation showing that there's going to be work. Yeah, Millie.
I understood that with the last administration that had been harder and harder to justify, and some of the bigger booking agents, their business affairs had been telling agents that they were no longer able to put in shows that weren't legit. Is that changing?
Oh, not legit. Yeah.
No,
So-
like they're not going to have a 3-year schedule down. Like
So this is the history of this problem. Years ago, what agents would do is they would fabricate a year or 3 years of gigs. They would just make this shit up and they would put it in the itineraries and they would send it off to Homeland Security and somehow think that was fine. When, of course, obviously, it's fraud. And it's bad to submit fraud to Homeland Security because eventually it's going to catch up with you. So it did catch up with some people, and there's issues when that happens. The sad thing is you don't need to do that. That's not the way to get a long-term visa. You have to show that there's an underlying contract under the duration that you're seeking. So if you've got a label contract for 3 years, or if you have a relationship with a U.S. agent and you can show a contract with that agent and it's a 3-year contract, that's the contract. You don't need to show gigs. We wouldn't even include the contracts for gigs because that would just confuse them. You show, I've got a contractual relationship with this agent. I've got an itinerary, which is explicitly the stuff that I'm planning to do, but it's explicitly conjectural. But as long as there's a contract that's underlying it that says, like, no, this is the contract that this petition's based on, the vast majority of the time that will be fine. Now, there's nuances to how to create the itinerary, so it's both honest, but also explaining gaps. You mentioned the 60-day gap. That's not a rule at all. That's nowhere in the regulations. The unions are trying to make the process more watertight, so they generally say 60 days or 30 days, depending on, I don't know what it is at this point. That's not a rule. It's just a rule of thumb that tries to make the petitions more approvable. But we regularly get petitions approved that have vastly larger gaps than that. And there's ways to do that. You just have to explain like what they're worried about is that the artist is going to come to the U.S., play a gig, then go on unemployment somehow for the next 6 months and become a public charge. If you can show they're coming playing this gig, but then they're going to be on tour in Europe for 3 months, then they're going to be recording in Japan, and then they're going to be on vacation for 3 months, and then they're going to be coming back 6 months later. And here's the contract for here's the gig that they're coming back to do 6 months later. Generally, that's going to work.
But so to your question, like P1 versus P2, and again, P2 is only available to Canadian musicians, but the musicians union that handles the P2 petitions has gotten more conservative.
Right.
So their advice is going to be more conservative than our advice. So it's difficult to get a full year-long P2 because of the union's requirements. But those aren't the government's requirements. That's
Right.
just the union sort of being conservative. But since the P2 process is generally a lot easier and cheaper, it's less of a concern, I think, than and so that's why a lot of Canadian musicians who have the P2 available choose to do P1 or to do an O1, O2, because it can be easier to get that full year or the full 3 years.
Millie, to your question about the major agencies, that's actually been we have not actually seen anything like that. We have not seen them getting more strict at all. In fact, if anything, it goes the other direction. They're starting to get a better sense of what the industry standards are. The truth of it is, though, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn about major agencies.
I'm just wondering who's here.
Right, exactly. Their legal departments are wanting to play it safe. And the idea of anything, first of all, they're not immigration lawyers, so they don't understand how this gets nuanced. And second, their job as the lawyer, of counsel lawyer for a major agency is to make sure there's no risks. And so what they're saying is no, we're not going to, you put an itinerary of exactly what's been contracted and that's it. Drives us crazy because we see artists all the time. Of course, because at the end of the day, this is recoupable. The artist is paying for this at the end of the day, right? And we see the artist paying $6,000, $10,000 to get a visa that lasts for 6 weeks when there's absolutely no reason to do that way. It happens only at the majors. All the indie agencies work with us on it and are like, oh yeah, no, we can work with you. We understand you. We believe you. But it's a real disadvantage to artists who are working at the most of, we're not going to name names, but most of the major agencies are understandably really careful, but it's to the detriment of their artists. I just went and said it, didn't I?
Yeah,
in
but,
public.
I
Yeah,
mean-
well, there it is. But to your question, what are the two parts? There's two parts that go into these petitions. Do you have employment of some sort? Can you show that you've got something you're supposed to be doing? And the second piece is, do you meet the standard for that visa? So if you're looking for an O1, can you show that you've got extraordinary ability? If it's P1, can you show that you're a member of an ensemble with sustained international renown? Now, the question of how do you show that I have extraordinary ability or sustained international renown, unfortunately, is kind of beyond the scope of this because it's massively complex. But I would signpost anybody who's wondering about that information to the Artists from Abroad website. There's another thing. Well, I'll post it at the end, but there's a website which goes into really good detail about what actually is the evidence you need to show to meet those standards.
There's a lot of really bad information on the internet, but Artists from Abroad is a great website that has accurate information. It's probably the only website on the internet that has accurate information about this stuff.
So the process about the petition part, but actually the process of getting the visa is somebody in the U.S., some entity, some petitioner in the U.S. has to file the petition on your behalf. Usually the employer or an entity or an agent or the festival or the venue, whatever it is, but some representative of the artist files the petition. It can't be the lawyer because that's a conflict of interest, but some U.S. entity files a petition that sets out to prove the artist is important and the artist has work. If that petition is approved, they're usually a couple hundred pages long, huge pile of stuff. That goes to Homeland Security, USCIS. They review it. They approve it, hopefully. If they don't, they kick it back to you and say, we don't like this, we don't like that, can you redo it? But normally or most of the time they approve it. The approval, notification of the approval gets sent around the world, to all the U.S. embassies and ports of entry. So they can see that, this artist has been approved. That's the point where that whole part used to be the hardest part of this process, getting the petition prepared, filed, and approved. It's not the hardest part anymore, unfortunately. The hardest part, except for Canadians, is, okay, great, you got your petition approved. It's effectively a work authorization. Now all you have to do is get the visa, right? So that means you you fill out a form online, you schedule an embassy appointment, you go in for an interview, just like that. You get your visa. That's the way it used to be. Well, what's happening now?
Well, so yeah, post-pandemic, the second part of the process, which, as Matthew said, used to be easy. And we should say it used to be easy for people from certain parts of the world. It was always difficult for artists from the global south and for artists from countries that the United States doesn't have good relations with. Because the purpose of this second part, if the purpose of the first part is to show you have work in the U.S., you're important enough or whatever to get the classification, the purpose of the second part is it's basically a security check. Is this person a security risk for some reason? are they a risk of overstaying their visa, legally immigrating to the U.S.? So this second part has always been difficult for certain artists, unfortunately, but it's now more fraught for everyone because since the pandemic and Afghanistan and Ukraine and other things that are going on in the world, the exodus of State Department employees during the Trump administration, most of the consular posts throughout the world are short-staffed, backlogged. So the wait times, it used to be you just schedule an appointment, you got your petition approved, you could get an appointment the next week. Now there's long waits for appointments, and also some posts are pushing people to process by mail, which usually takes longer. But in certain embassies, if you're eligible for a waiver of the interview, which sounds like a good thing, you don't have to go in person, wake up at 7 in the morning, show up at the embassy, and go through security and sit around for half your day. The interview waiver, the mail-in process, is taking longer than doing an in-person interview. So, I mean, it's getting better. That's the good news. Or it's getting better most places. It's very country specific and post specific, yeah.
A question we get a lot from artists who've had the approval, and their departure date is imminent. They're not going to get the interview on time. Do they still turn up and try and travel?
That's a great question. So there's something, I'll try to keep this quick because that's a sort of a complex question. There is something called an I-193 waiver, which is basically a waiver that can be granted by U.S. Customs and Border Protection at the airport when the person shows up, a waiver of the visa requirement. So basically, you get on the plane with ESTA, and you have your petition approval with you, and you sort of beg for mercy when you get to customs and say, I wasn't able to get my visa in time for X, Y, and Z reasons.
Clear in Dublin, so you could
Right.
have that happen
Yeah.
in Dublin. Yeah.
The problem with that waiver is I feel like you're probably just cringing when we're saying this. It's something you only use. Like there was a time a few years ago when all the visa processing system all over the world broke, and the State Department couldn't issue visas for like 2 weeks. And at that point, we were just having artists just flying to the U.S., just like show up, give it a try. And they were issuing these waivers all the time because they were like, yeah, of course you didn't have your visa. Our system doesn't work, and it was fine. There has been indications that we've got from Customs and Border Protection that they are reasonably open to this because they're aware of the problems at the U.S. embassies. But I'm still terrified. The idea of telling an artist like, get on the plane, it'll probably be fine. I don't know. It's really scary. And the other problem with it, the whole misrepresentation question, like you're getting on the plane saying I'm going ESTA or with a B1 visa, and you're representing yourself upon getting on the plane that's what you're going to do, and then you sort of change your mind when you get here. It makes sense, but it's possible that an officer might say, well, that's also fraud, and it would be really awful for an officer to do that. But it's a very risky process, but we have done it on a number of occasions recently when the artist is like, my whole career is riding on this. I've got to get there. And I can't get an interview until like February. What am I going to do?
Generally, we advise against it unless there's some actual, like we've had situations where an artist got their visa, didn't look at it, and then realized, oh, there's a typo, and instead of expiring in 2024, it expires in 2022, which is in the past. That doesn't make any sense, but I'm flying tomorrow. In those situations, like where it's clear error and there wasn't time to get it rectified, usually they're more open to it in situations like that. If it's just like, I filed my petition late and I couldn't get an appointment in time and I really want to come and do my tour, like it's really risky, and we've had clients get thrown into secondary for half the night and then sent home on a plane, and it's really unpleasant. So I would reserve that for extreme situations.
The situation though is if you're in a country where there's a major delay, if your artist is like, their petition's been approved, this is great, I'm about to go, and then they go onto the website of the embassy website to try to schedule their appointment, it's like, oh, there's no appointment available until May 24. What do I do? The answer to this is don't give up. That's not you don't stop fighting at that point. the fundamental trick is you take that embassy appointment in May of 24, and then you start fighting to get it rescheduled. And that's something that you can do. You can do it yourself. There's a way to like contact the embassy to request an emergency interview. Certainly something that we do with our clients all the time. And generally, for artists who are coming to work, it's possible to get an emergency interview in most places. But the thing that's really tough about right now is that every country is different. Every U.S. embassy is different. And it changes from week to week. Like this week, London's great. Next week, suddenly London has an 8-week delay. And last week, Lisbon was the place to send anybody. And now suddenly, Lisbon actually shut down for a week because they can't process something. Like it's mayhem.
Frankfurt is taking applicants from other countries, but then suddenly they're limited to only German citizens and legal residents.
So the last 2 years has been just basically a running game. Like, Bucharest. Everybody goes to Bucharest, and then
they shut it down.
Then they shut it down. It's like, okay, Belfast. We'll send everybody to Belfast. Like it's been crazy. So I think the word on that is, again, this is something that we can help with, and it doesn't cost anything. So if you are working on your own artist, and obviously, if you're working with an attorney, they should know this stuff and they can help you with it. If you're not, and you need information about what's happening in the field, this is something that we can help you understand what's working where.
One thing I want to quickly say on the topic of requesting an expedited appointment, always frame things in terms of the urgency to U.S. interests. So if I don't make the show, my label and my agent and the venues and the promoters are all going to lose money. It's not, my career is riding on this. The U.S. consulates don't care about that. They care about U.S. interests. So always be sure to frame things in terms of U.S.
Basic information, how long does it take? Petition? What are petitions taking right now?
Well, that's a difficult question because there's 2 processing centers. California, where half the country has to file petitions, is taking like 3 or 4 months for regular processing, whereas Vermont is taking more like 4 to 6 weeks currently. It's always changing, but right now California is a lot slower than Vermont.
Right.
So
you can always throw $2,500 at them and make it go faster. That usually works. The premium processing. Once the petitions have been approved, this is what we were talking about, the process of getting the visa at the embassy. It's kind of, anybody knows. Under normal circumstances, what you're looking at is like the 2 to 3 months for the petition part, and a month you want to leave it. See, we would always tell people you want to be starting the process 6 months, minimum 6 months before the artist needs to be in the U.S. Costs, I'm sure people are concerned about the proposed cost increases. We don't know if it's going to happen at all. The world, the international cultural sector has done an amazing job of flooding USCIS with comments and about their concerns. Last time they tried this, it was shut down in court. I'm not an optimistic person by nature, but I think there's a reasonably good chance that this is going to get delayed and may not happen at all. But I don't know. Who knows? No, but I would say, given the number of comments that they have to sift through, I would be surprised to see anything before the autumn. Also remember, if you're reading the UK press presented this as the cost of US visas is going to triple. That's not true. The cost of the filing fee, which is a little tiny piece of the cost of getting a visa, it's still good. It's going to cost people $1,000 more, or it's going to cost ensembles $1,000 more, unless it's more than 25 people, in which case the costs really do add up. $1,000 is a lot, but it's not what has been presented. It's not what a lot of people are seeing. It's like, well, okay, it cost me $5,000 to get my visa last time. It's going to cost me $15,000. That's not how it works. It's still bad, but it's not quite what it was. Yeah.
So just to add to that, are we talking about all the type of visas under ONP or?
Yep, it's everything.
Just a quick one about the last time this happened, and you said that it ended up being quashed in court.
Mm-hmm.
And who brought that, and what was the premise for the decision to abandon that?
That was a unique situation because it turned out the person who engineered the fee increase had never actually been properly appointed by President Trump, and so the actions that he had taken in office were not actually legally viable. So that was the reason for that one. Gotta love it. Gotta love our government. It was a technicality, but there's also some technicalities with this one, which are really dubious. So I don't know. We'll see. We are totally out of time, which is a pity because there's a lot. Oh, I want to do one thing here. We talked about that. We talked about that. Great resources. Okay, there's the Artists from Abroad website. Take a picture of this. It's great information. Thomas.avail is there to provide limited pro bono legal assistance. If you need help, ask us. We'll either help or tell you we can't. The League of American Orchestras is also incredibly useful in providing information about visas. And also down at the bottom, it isn't really applicable to US issues, but On the Move is a Brussels-based umbrella organization of organizations like Thomas that help with international mobility issues for artists. So if you've got an artist who's going to Portugal and you want to figure out the taxes, contact On the Move. They would contact you with the Portuguese partner, and they can help you figure out this stuff. So it's a good website to be aware of. Will, have we missed anything critical?
I don't think so. Do we have? I mean, I know we're fully out of time. I guess are there any final questions? We can always talk afterwards as well.
That's a great question. It really depends on who you work with, because the filing fee for these petitions is like $460 at the moment. That's not that bad. Union fee, you're gonna have to pay the union $250 generally. That's not that bad. If you're getting the visas, those are gonna be $190 per person. It's a lot if you've got a big ensemble. The major fee is the legal fee, is hiring the attorney to put a whole thing together. And so that's the, when people say it cost me $5,000 to get an O1, most of that is a legal fee.
And
Unless
the
premium
range is enormous in
Right.
terms of legal fees, from $2,000 up to $10,000.
Yeah.
It depends on who you're working with.
So, yes, Millie.
What is the history behind Canada being allowed to have the A2?
That's a great question.
That's a question I would love to talk with you about, and I have sort of an answer, but also it's kind of shrouded in mystery. But we're going to have to do that afterwards. But it's a good question, though. I think that's it. Thank you all for coming. It gets lost in the forest, exactly. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks a lot.